Jack.
Levi.
The Book Club from Hell.
Do we need a hook for Freud, given that basically everyone's heard of Freud and everyone knows him as the funny man who talks about how boys want to fuck their mums and kill their dads? Also known as the Oedipus complex, which was much less prominent in this book than I expected it to be. Because apparently this is the book where he first lays it out, or at least insofar as I'm aware. And it took up maybe 2 to 3 pages in the edition I read. I think you read the same one. It's
I think you sent me the same
Oxford World's Classics one. Translation by Joyce Crick. So I'd read this one because the second edition is longer and the additions made to it I'm not convinced add a great deal. Mostly Freud talking about staircases and penis symbols in dreams. I decided we didn't necessarily need that. But,
yeah, that's a pretty good hook.
Yeah, okay. It's Freud.
Funny penis man.
Funny penis man. Funny penis cocaine man from Austria.
That everybody knows about, but
that has massively influenced our conception of the mind.
Yeah, in the West, and probably very few people have read.
Yeah, not... I think particularly his longer works, because he has shorter works that were in his day quite popular, that were about psychoanalyzing everyday life, or that say non-clinical applications of psychoanalysis, that I think are more read. But his bigger, more dense works, like the topic of today's episode, the interpretation of dreams, and then also some of his later works, like the Ego and the Id, I think are read less. Particularly the interpretation of dreams, if people are interested in Freud, and I'll spoil the end of the episode by saying I definitely recommend this book right now. This is a great place to start because this is where, at least, by Freud's own consideration, where he really started doing his most serious work. I think at the end of his life, he said, Interpretation of Dreams is the book that I just don't regret. I'm happy with it. It's where he really sets out the structure of the mind, which he would modify later. He sets out a structure of the mind as the conscious, preconscious, unconscious in this book, upon which later in his life he layered the well-known other structure of the id, ego, superego. But it's a super important book for Freud, if people are just interested in getting to know Freud's thought, but also just in understanding at least the Western conception of the mind. It's hard to understate how influential this guy is. Even in modern psychology, which is much more behaviorist, and I don't think you'll find many clinical psychologists today who will say, I treat according to a Freudian paradigm. Even they feel the constant need to argue with Freud and to say, this is why we're not Freudian, this is why Freud's wrong, and to contrast their theories with Freud. So even when people don't want to be Freudian in dealing with the mind, they still have to answer Freud. His influence is gigantic.
Yeah, I didn't necessarily think about it too much, but when I was studying neuroscience when I was younger in my undergrad, to the degree that there were subjects that I studied that were less about the physiological and electrochemical and so forth, like physical aspects of the brain, other subjects on sleep or addiction or mental illness, there's aspects that like neuroscientists have to engage at least somewhat in the psychological side of it. Permeates this idea, at the very least, the idea of there being some distinction between the conscious mind and a bubbling menagerie of other processes that are not conscious going on. It's just, permeates throughout all of the field of, I suppose, like neuropsychology, the intersection between the two. And it's not clear to me that, at least in the West, because as he discusses in the first part of the book, and as Jung discussed, there's, say the ancients in Western culture, they had other conceptions of dreams, and in other cultures they've got different conceptions of dreams. But at least in the modern West, there's a strong sense of a clinical or well-being or so forth, like personal connection, some sort of sensible connection between the unconscious and the conscious mind. And I, as far as I can see, Freud was the first person to attempt to put that concept onto some sort of firm theoretical framework.
Yeah, because we'll definitely get into this a bit more once we talk about his problem situation. But the idea of an unconscious was being thrown around at the time. I'm pretty sure Schopenhauer wrote about it a fair bit. And then more clinically minded people were too. But Freud, I think particularly him structuring the unconscious rather than just saying, oh, it's a collection of stuff that you're not conscious of, so it's trivially unconscious. Instead of that, he tried to structure it in this book as the unconscious proper and the preconscious, and then talking about the energetic libidinal flow between the two of those and the conscious. But yeah, I really enjoyed this.
He also created
sorry, go on.
Yeah, just to add a little bit to what you said, he didn't not only just created a structure, an explicit structure, but he gave also a causal account of the relationship between the conscious and the unconscious, which I think would probably be like the one of the breakthroughs of the book.
Yeah. And we'll jump on to our impressions going into the book next. But first, I want to glaze Freud a little bit more, and also tell listeners. So it's really fun making fun of Freud, and I'm almost definitely going to make fun of Oedipus Penis Man in the course of the episode. And I just want to make it clear, like it's from a place of love. I liked this a lot more than I thought it would.
Yeah.
And I can't even remember what I was going to say about Freud's influence. Just gigantic. I did have something else I was going to say, but I'm sure I'll remember it in the middle of another section where it's much more inopportune to talk about. How about we talk about our impressions?
Our thoughts going in and
thoughts going into this.
Yeah.
And prior experience with Freud.
Yeah, okay. Do you want to go first or do you want
Yeah, sure. I had a period, probably when I was 19 or 20, of being more interested in psychoanalysis and more interested in the influence of psychoanalysis on certain Marxists. And so I'd read a little bit of Freud. It's sufficiently long ago that I don't exactly remember which ones. I think it was Civilization and Its Discontents. And I think there was one called Introduction to Psychoanalysis. I think there was one about love, the psychology of love or something. I doubt that's the actual title, but I read a few shorter works of his. And I'd say I liked them, didn't particularly love them. And I was going into this book on a sort of a hazy background of having read Freud quite a while ago. Plus, just the detritus of not taking him so seriously, having gone through a more conventional medical education, so you'll have certain psychiatrists who find Freud interesting, depending on how kooky they are, their proclivity to wear robes into work, and so on. Shout out to psychiatrists. But no one was treating within a Freudian paradigm, or at least a consciously Freudian paradigm. So I was thinking that I would read this book, find bits of it sort of amusing and be largely unimpressed, and I was totally wrong. It's a really good book. That's what I was going to say. Sorry. The wonders of the preconscious mind. So I was wanting to say maybe the greatest achievement of the interpretation of dreams is, even if some of his claims in the book you don't think are factually accurate. So suppose you don't agree with this energetic circle model of the mind. If you don't agree that the mind is divided into these psi systems and so on, what Freud did here was create a germ of knowledge, or just a theoretical framework upon which other people can build, or they can critique it and in doing so build new knowledge. He created something that nucleates forming new knowledge, which is a huge achievement. And that's my probably my biggest compliment of this book. It's something really new that then kicked off over 100 years of discussion and criticism, which is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, absolutely. And overall, he won you over.
Yeah, he really did. I wasn't going into this with hostility. I was really thinking he was funny penis man, whose theories had been superseded. But I think it's also something else to consider, and then I'll let you speak, is how you want to approach this book. So are you going to approach it from a purely, say, just a clinical medical perspective? You can ask about, okay, well, experimentally, how did he arrive at these particular conclusions? What are the treatment outcomes for say, free association in trying to work out the providence of a particular dream and so on? Or you can examine it from, as our listener Moog implored us to, shout out to Moog, an examination of the subject, which I think is a really interesting way of looking at this, because so much of this book is actually approaching clinical psychology or psychotherapy from the perspective of the human being as a subjectivity, rather than the more behaviorist model where almost the internal state doesn't matter so much. Just what happens is what they do in the world, and that's all you particularly care about and all you care to measure. So I also found it really interesting and really gratifying, this extended meditation on almost the human being as a desiring animal and what that means. Yeah. He really won me over.
Nice. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, so my thoughts going in, a bit eye-rolly.
I feel like we were both going into this with similar feelings.
A bit eye-rolly, but like you, I actually came away having been completely won over, at least, if not in terms of the veracity of the explanation itself, at least kind of being on Freud's side with regards to his, I suppose, project or his goal in laying out or beginning to lay out a science of consciousness and sentience and the mind. I think that I used to think, okay, if you can think of a field such as, what would be a good example from, say, a scientific field? Oh, okay, so astronomy is a really good example. Astronomy and cosmology. There's a point at which you can say some point, I don't know, old Neolithic beliefs or early Bronze Age beliefs, which you can point at and think those are pre-scientific. And then there's a point at which people start asking, say, for example, say some of the Mesopotamians, where they still had essentially astrology and supernatural beliefs, but then they're doing things like they're starting to measure the transit of certain objects in the sky, and they're becoming less supernatural and more naturalistic in their approach. And I'd consider that sort of proto-science, that sort of transition phase, where a particular field of knowledge is starting to transition from pre-science, mythological, or supernatural or based purely on, explanations based purely on tradition, essentially. And then at some point you can say, well, this is the point at which we have a science of the field. And the science of the field is trying to understand whatever the phenomena is in terms of non-anthropocentric, non-cultural, explanatory structures that are also consilient with other fields of knowledge. So in astronomy, you might say Tycho Brahe or Galileo Galilei. The specific, and that period of European, like navigation, and they need to use the stars to navigate properly. And so, there wasn't really any room if you're trying to like go from England to Australia to have too much astrology in the way that you approach. You just need to be thinking, okay, these, using them mechanistically, essentially using the stars mechanistically. And I used to think of Freud as not pre-scientific, definitely not pre-scientific, but I sort of thought of it as proto-science. And maybe that's reasonable, but actually I'm starting to think, after having read this, I would say like Freud is scientific, with one caveat around that I've mentioned before on other things, on other podcasts, that Popper has pointed out around it not being falsifiable. But other than that sort of main caveat, I think I would consider Freud scientific insofar as he's trying to have a non sort of culturally relative, non-supernatural explanation of the structure of the mind, and it's the first attempt, as far as I'm aware, other than the physiologist whom he mentions in the start of the book. And having said that, I would say that it's a breakthrough, like it's a massive breakthrough. It's like it's a huge theoretical breakthrough, and as Jack already said, it's a germ that has led to a huge amount of innovation in psychology, neuropsychology. It's given birth to whole schools of thought around, say, Jungian psychoanalysis, or like modern ideas of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and all these other forms of therapy that take into account unconscious elements of the mind. So having said that, yeah, definitely won me over. And if I was to pick a side between behaviorism and Freudianism, I think that building on Freud, criticizing and building on Freud, is a much more fruitful path toward proper understanding of the mind than behaviorism. To me, like, behaviorism, it's just treating the mind as a black box, in its pure form. And like, how can you possibly make progress in terms of an explanatory understanding of the mind if you're just like, oh, it's just a black box, let me just give it some stimuli and see what happens? You're like, it actually stops progress in understanding the proper interior structure of the mind. Whereas Freud can like yield progress.
In a funny way, Freud pushes the black box more into the deep unconscious.
Yeah.
And this is only a partial digression, because we actually will talk about this a lot, but so much of the psychoanalytic project is to try to work out the structure of the unconscious and what's going on there by looking at the inputs into the unconscious and what it spits out into the conscious through the preconscious, and sometimes through the sensory apparatus, in the case of regression. So, I mean, in some ways, Freud also has a black box. He just pushes it into the subjectivity, and you have to examine it from within the subject.
Yeah, I can see what you're saying. I guess, at least to me, it's there's more interior structure to Freud's explanation than just a pure Pavlovian approach to the subject. So I think it's really worth reading. I never read a full book of Freud's, but I did sort of poke around when I was younger, I think, into his Taboos book and into Civilization as Discontent and maybe the book on narcissism, but I never read them in full. And I think this one is worth reading, having read it now.
Yeah. On the basis of this, I probably will go and read The Ego and the Id. I think that's what it's called. I think that was one of his last books. And that represents the very mature Freud and his approach to, or his idea of how the mind is structured. So do you want to go into the problem situation, which we've touched on a bit?
Yeah, let me pull up my notes.
So, problem situation was... So, in this book, the book is about how to interpret dreams, as one might infer from the name of the book. But that is more a way to get into examining how the mind is structured. Or at least that's how I felt reading this book, that the interpretation of dreams is a way to examine the unconscious. So his problem situation, there were a few aspects to it. So Freud was a clinician. So he was... Actually, I'll give it his time as well. So he was born in 1856 in, I think, it was called Freiburg at the time in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's now called Przybor in Moravia, Czech Republic.
Oh, yeah, right.
Funny, Przybor means cutlery. I don't know the etymology of that particular name. And he died in 1939 in the UK.
So culturally, would he have been German, Austrian?
Yeah, he was German speaking.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he moved to Vienna quite young.
Yeah.
So he got an MD from the University of Vienna. He started his private practice in psychotherapy in 1886. And this book, The Interpretation of Dreams, published 1899. I think would have been, 33, depending on the month he was born. It actually had a second edition in 1909, which has many more penis metaphors. We didn't read that one. So that's a little bit of contextualization. So at the time, there was a lot of interest in how the mind works. The idea of the unconscious mind and the conscious mind was definitely in circulation, and Freud was responding to that. He was fairly practical as well, so he was seeing patients. He'd been seeing them privately since 1886. He'd been treating patients as a neurologist before then, since graduation. Was also involved in medical research. I forget whom he was studying under, but he did work on neuroanatomy, so comparative neuroanatomy in a variety of animals. And I think some of the results of that went into the work that established the structure of the neuron, which is big. Like he even just in
pretty important.
Even just in that, he's actually made pretty significant contributions to medical science. So he was a serious clinician. I think a lot of the talk around Freud presents him as kind of frivolous. He really wasn't. So that clinical aspect was another part of his problem situation, because he's wanting to treat patients. So treat patients of his with neuroses, there's a lot of talk of hysteria in this book. So at his time at least, what was then called hysteria would be today called more conversion disorder. So it's basically mental processes causing some sort of physical symptoms, or physical symptoms without a clear physical cause. Leg pain without a big gash in your leg. It's something subjective and internal causing this distress. And he was wanting a way to treat these things, and he tried a few things. So he tried hypnosis for a while. That didn't work so well. He got into some other kooky theories. He fell in with, I think, a surgeon who was convinced that particularly the turbinate bones in the nose caused all sorts of psychic disturbances, and by filing them off in different ways, you could cure diseases. Got interested in cocaine for a while as a potential psychic treatment. rather than a way to commune with the NASDAQ index. He tried a lot of things, but came to dream analysis and stuck with it for the rest of his clinical career. And free associative way of analysing dreams to try to bring the conscious mind, or bring bits of the unconscious closer to the conscious mind. And we'll get into the structure of these things and what specifically it means to bring an unconscious thought or a preconscious thought to the conscious mind later. So this was another big consideration in his problem situation. Then there's another part too, which is dreams and the analysis of dreams was just taken more seriously as a field of study in 19th century Vienna than it is today in the West. And that's not to say that their view of dreams was necessarily mystical, but they considered dreams to be potentially of importance to one's psychology, possibly to their health. And so the first chapter of this book is him basically doing a literature review of other dream theories of his time. That was pretty fun to read, particularly reading about the dream experiments, so how various scientists made experiments to study where dreams came from, what dreams might mean, and so on. So that's another big part of his problem situation. Can you think of other bits? I'm sure there are other bits. It's quite a complex problem situation.
As a clinician, yeah, I think it's maybe in his later works it's lost, but obviously I don't know because I would need to read them. But from my understanding, it's in this book it's extremely clinical. It's he's concerned with people's well-being, essentially. I think maybe an important thing to note is that he wasn't content with physicalist or physiological or purely physiological explanations of neuroses.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And that, say for example, something like, say ADHD. ADHD is considered a neurodevelopmental disorder as well, but also having behavioral and psychological signs and symptoms. And so, a reductive conception of ADHD would just be to reduce it to the explanation of ADHD to, developmental neurobiology and the effects that that has on, whatever's going on at a cellular level or a neuroanatomical level, like aberrant firing or whatever circuitry in the brain. And that might be part of it, except to explain it only in terms of that is reductive. And a non-reductive explanation would include elements of, say, being able to learn or not having learned, conscious executive function, self-regulating behaviors, and aims and objectives and motivations and childhood trauma and that sort of stuff. And so I think there's still people that are extremely reductive today in the field, but he was I think trying to make a case that there's significant parts of what we'd call today mental illnesses, what they might have called things neuroses. He was trying to say no, there's a non-physical element here, essentially. And even if you want to look at it through the lens of, well, is Freud being reductive on the other extreme? Well, maybe, but actually his role to play was also pushing back on physicalism, over reductive physicalism. And so I think there's I don't know if you want to think about it in terms of pendulums and stuff, but swinging within a field to and from different approaches to creating explanations in the field. I'd say he was also playing that part, and the other big part of his problem situation is not having a supernatural explanation.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah.
So I'd say those two things is trying to have a psychological rather than just purely reductive physicalist or physiological explanation, and having a non-supernatural explanation.
Yeah. It's good that you brought up that he was trying to understand the psyche in terms of the psyche.
Yeah.
Because he says that very, very bluntly, I think, within the first chapter, that that's what he wants to do.
And what's really nice about the first chapter actually is, as Jack said, it's essentially a literature review. And I feel like he covered a lot of different ideas very quickly. And
yeah, he covered a lot of ground.
And he probably could have expanded the first chapter into its own 500-page book of just the literature review and compare and contrast a different approach. But at least given the brevity of the first chapter, he was clearly taking seriously the other ideas in the zeitgeist in his field at the time, which is nice. He wasn't... I almost don't feel as though... A lot of it was literally just stating, this is what this person thinks.
This is what this person thinks, and as the chapter went on, he began to bring in, and this is what I think is wrong with it, but it wasn't... So it's not like reading Marx talking about other people in his field, where he just blasts them.
Yeah, it was in good faith. Whereas I'd say somebody like Marx, when you, as you noted, like, it's not necessarily in good faith, or it doesn't feel like it's in good faith.
It's extremely combative.
And whereas I think that Freud was taking his contemporaries seriously and was trying to engage them critically in good faith.
Yeah. And so I just want to note the structure of the book before we get on to the key ideas in it, because I really like how it's structured. So we've read a number of books on this show where they'll basically state their thesis in more abstract terms and just lay out basically this mental model that they've constructed in the first chapter or two. And then the rest of the book is them applying it in various situations or collecting evidence and presenting it for their position. This is quite common because it works really well. And I like that way of presenting information quite a bit. Freud takes a different approach in this book, and I really like it. It's pedagogically quite good because you remember things very well. So what he does is his conceit basically in the structure of the book is he too, with you the reader, is walking through his thought processes and his problem situation and arriving at, by the end of the book, an answer, or at least a provisional answer to his set of questions on, what is a dream? What are dreams for? So it begins with a literature review. It will then get into, say, some of the features of dreams, what might be happening to lead to some of these features of dreams. And he just keeps walking through and building and building and building on this until quite naturally and very fluidly, by the end of the book, he's talking about the structure of the mind, this energy circuit model between the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious. All the while constantly referring back to, so he has some dreams that, he has a lot of dreams in this book that he will offer accounts of, but there are a few, in particular, Irma's injection, which is a fairly famous dream among Freudians, that he'll analyze in different ways and draw more out of now that he has, in the context of the book, arrived at more knowledge, arrived at some new aspect of his burgeoning model of how the mind works and what dreams are and how to interpret them. And I really enjoyed it. I thought this was such a good way to write a book. It led to one of the rare situations with these sorts of books where I enjoy myself at the end more than I did at the beginning. Oftentimes I'll like the first half and then get a bit sick of it because they're just repeating themselves. Whereas in this, he was just always giving you a little bit more right up until the last page. And
edging the shit out of you the whole time.
Yeah, it was a slow burn. It was really good.
Yeah, one thing that I really appreciated about it as well is the cogency and clarity of his writing. Obviously it's also a really, for this particular edition, a good translation, I suppose. That helps, but he's not like that school of German philosophy, German idealism or something, where, or whatever one you've spoken about, where it's
he was writing for clarity. He wasn't trying to
he's the
turn you
opposite of those.
down.
Yeah, people who are just trying to confusion ray you. I think in the spirit of a true scientist who really cares about making progress in his particular field, he did the right thing, which is to try to write for clarity amongst his peers.
A note on the translation as well. So a lot of Freudian terminology in English is from previous translations. So the one we read for this episode by Joyce Crick is a newer translation.
Yeah.
So some of the terminology we'll use in this episode might be slightly different to other people talking about Freud, because we're using the terminology as translated by Crick.
There'd be like an example, like dream work and dream distortion. Is that like might be
I forget the name of the translator of Freud's, from whose translation a lot of English language Freudian terminology is based, but a lot of it was I think it was consciously trying to be sort of Latinate or Greek to mirror other medical terminology or medical terminology.
Yeah.
Whereas Crick, in her translator's note, said that she was trying not to do that and trying to make it more clear to someone who just speaks English like a normal person. So that for people who are more familiar with Freud, that's just something to be aware of in our discussion of this book, in this episode, is we're going to be using her terminology.
Yeah.
And
so also kudos to Crick in that case.
Yeah, well. I mean, for what it's worth, I found the terminology pretty intuitive to understand, the way she translated it. It sounds quite difficult to render some of Freud's terms into English just because of some of the ambiguities that always exist in any translation.
Yeah.
But also how different terms will be referring to different things, but also related things. Are you wanting to make a distinction between those things, but also demonstrate some sort of connection? And I think she did it well. For what it's worth, someone who doesn't speak German.
Yeah. And for what it's worth, last little bit about the problem situation is, I think it's fair to say that despite all the criticisms one can throw at Freud, I think it's fair to say that he was a genius by any measure of his contributions to the world, but also in terms of his academic and medical career. The contributions to the comparative neuroscience, the psychology stuff. But also, didn't he speak like 5 languages or something? He
The guy
spoke
was
Latin, French,
the guy,
German, English.
When he rolled his character, just maxed out intelligence.
Yeah,
it was definitely like a min-max intelligence build.
Yeah,
massively multilingual. I forget how many languages he spoke, but at the very least, German, French, English. I think he spoke Spanish as well,
and
Latin and Greek.
Yeah,
probably a bunch of others. He was a very competent clinician, very competent laboratory scientist.
And philosopher. He was very familiar with the Western canon of philosophy.
Yeah, and reading this book, you get some sense of the man's erudition in how he interprets dreams. We'll go into specifically the free associative model of how he interprets dreams, but when he walks you through how he would do it, you get a sense of just how much more he knows about everything.
Yeah. He's literally the same.
He'll be making like puns between 3 languages and then referencing that to some bit of trivia from classical philosophy and some philosophical concept. And you're like, listen, mate, I take your word for it. These things are linked.
Yeah. I think there's a class of people, I put Jung in there as well, who just have a breathtaking depth and breadth to their knowledge. And what's really interesting is that it's not just they can say what Plato said. They're actually using that knowledge to, in a generative way, trying to create new theories and pulling on Aristotle and Plato and Nietzsche, and if it's Jung, it would be like he's pulling on Freud as well and criticizing Adler. And it's just like, where did these guys get the time?
Yeah, it's such a slippery term, because you said genius. It's such a slippery term, but there are parts of reading this book where I thought, yeah, this guy is just of a different species.
Yeah, there's people like that, and Freud was one of those people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So should we start talking about the meat of this book? We took 40 minutes to get into it, but there's just so much background to this sort of work that I think it's by our standards, we weren't very discursive. That was definitely more of a preconscious approach than unconscious.
I think without that context, though, if we just jump straight into the mechanics of what he describes, probably I don't think a listener would appreciate the
achievement.
The
to the same extent.
Yeah. So I think it's fine.
So I reckon, how about I open up with a quote? It's a longer one, and it won't necessarily make sense to listeners at first, but we'll walk through all of the steps to make it make sense. So 328, 329. So want to start off with just asking the question, what's a dream? Because you might have an intuitive sense of what it is. It's the pictures that play when I'm asleep. But for Freud, there's a lot more to it. So I quote, "The work of the psyche in the formation of dreams can be broken down into two tasks. It generates the dream thoughts and it transforms them into the dream content. The dream thoughts are entirely reasonable and are formed with all the expense of psychical energy we are capable of. They belong to that dimension of our thinking which has not become conscious, and from which, by some transposition, our conscious thoughts also arise. However, many unanswered questions and puzzles the dream thoughts raise, all the same these puzzles do not have any particular relation to dreams, and do not merit treatment among the problems of dreams. On the other hand, the other task of transforming the unconscious thoughts into the dream content is peculiar to the life of dreams and characteristic of it. This is the true dream work, and it is far more remote from the model of waking thought than even the most determined belittlers of the psyche's feats of dream formation have thought. It is not that it is more negligent, more unreasonable, more forgetful, more incomplete, say, than waking thought. It is qualitatively something completely different from it, and so at first not comparable to it. It does not think, calculate, judge in any way at all. It confines itself to reshaping. It can be described exhaustively if we keep our eye on the conditions which its product has to satisfy. Above all, this product, the dream, has to be removed from the influence of the censorship. And for this purpose, the dream work makes use of the displacement of psychical intensities to the point of a transvaluation of all psychical values. Thoughts are to be reproduced exclusively or predominantly in terms of the material provided by visual and oral memory traces, and this requires the dream work to take account of representability, which it does by setting up new displacements. Greater intensities than the dream thoughts have at their disposal at night are probably to be created, and this purpose is served by the ample condensation undertaken with the elements of the dream thoughts. Little account is taken of the logical relations in the thought material. They are ultimately given a hidden representation in particular formal features of the dreams. The affects of the dream thoughts are subject to less modifications than the imagined ideas of their content are. As a rule, they are suppressed. Where they are retained, they are separated from their ideas and combined with affects of similar tonality. Only one part of the dream work, the revisions, variable in extent, made by our partially roused waking thought, conforms to the conception our authorities would apply to the entire activity of dream formation." So that was a big quote, but I really like that one because there he lays out basically the whole structure of what we're about to talk about. And in the course of this episode, that quote's going to start to make sense to people. So let's start
Hopefully it'll
out.
make sense to Jack and I as well at some
Yeah.
point in the episode.
So we can start out with what's a dream. So at their core, and what Freud really belabors in this book, all dreams are infantile wish fulfillments filtered through dream distortion. What does that mean? So there are a few things here. One, what's a wish? So we can go into more detail specifically on what a wish is later. I know I'm saying this a lot, but Freud's thought is high. It's a very interconnected system. Basically, a childhood wish, it's the desire for a return of the sensation or object of that wish's first fulfillment in childhood, that experience of satisfaction. And nothing in the mind motivates except for wishes. So this is not just in the context of dreams. It's the mind in general. And these can be conscious or unconscious wishes. Childhood ones tend to be unconscious and tend to be very psychically energetic. They're just shooting off energy. So in a dream is ultimately the experience, so your conscious experience when you're asleep, of a wish trying to fulfill itself. And it is trying to fulfill itself past censorship or resistance. And again, we'll get into the exact structure of what causes this censorship. But this is what sets up this distinction between what Freud calls the manifest content of a dream. So that's what you dream. That's what you experience in a dream when you wake up and you had some dream about Vin Diesel being your letterbox and handing you a group of electricity bills, and you think, oh gee, I dreamed about Vin Diesel again. Your Vin Diesel dream, that's the manifest content of the dream. But what's happening in your unconscious? What unconsciously is causing your conscious mind to start dreaming about Vin Diesel as a letterbox? That's the question. That's the specific question that Freud in 1899 was setting out to answer, why he was dreaming about Vin Diesel so much. So the latent content of the dream is what Freud called the dream thoughts. These things sitting in your unconscious mind. So it sounds silly to say, but it's important to belabor. These things sitting in your unconscious mind, you're not aware of them directly. You're certainly aware of them indirectly because they're causing effects on your conscious mind. And so in the case of dreams, they're filtering through, but they're being filtered and distorted in an attempt to evade censorship and get into your consciousness. So this process of an unconscious wish or wishes expressing themselves in a way to evade censorship and get into your conscious mind, Freud called dream work. Also, before we move on, I want to say that the wish selection is interesting. So Freud notes a few times that you dream of things that happened that day or maybe the day before. Like there's a real recency bias. And Freud said that this is the case because during the day when you're walking around doing whatever it is that you do during the day, you're accruing memories, you're accruing sensations which are encoded into memories. And this is all basically providing material for dreams, and a wish will be selected based on what represents it well. So you've got all of this material, these various experiences and symbols from your waking day, and the wish that can be expressed around censorship using these experiences is most likely that wish that is going to form a dream when you're sleeping. So I hope I explained myself fairly clearly there. We're going to be repeating these particular terms a lot in this episode. So,
Yeah.
Listener,
Maybe-
if you don't remember them straight off now, you'll hear us repeat ourselves so often that you will by the end of this.
Yeah, I kind of was thinking of it as there's the dream thoughts are almost an inexplicit substructure out of which the manifest dream content is constructed. So what I mean by that is the manifest dream content, the images that you remember, the words that you spoke to some character in your dream, like, oh boy, if I were at that pub fight, I would have said this. I would have punched him like that, but you didn't because you're actually a pussy when you're awake. No, shut up, past Levi. No, violence is not good. Like that's your explicit content. Manifest content. What I'm saying here is that's explicit. You can describe the character. You can describe the sequence of events, and you can explain them and communicate them both to yourself and to others. So if you've ever done dream journaling, when you wake up and you immediately write down your dream, that is you writing down the explicit content of the dream, according to my terminology, and the manifest content. And at least, correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I can understand, I would say that there's essentially as I said before, an explicit substructure that is generating the manifest content of the dream. And the question is essentially, why does the manifest content of the dream have the content that it does? And Freud is basically arguing that substructure, the inexplicit substructure, is in large part pleasure, unpleasure, wish fulfilling substructure that is deeply rooted in infantile desires and urges.
Yeah, and I guess explicitness is interesting because I guess this is where the examination of the subject aspect of this deepens in a really cool way, because explicitness is from the perspective of consciousness, which at the moment we are. Like something being conscious is it being explicit.
Yeah.
And something being unconscious is an inexplicitness because we consciously can't grab it. So that gets a little bit more complex because I think the preconscious is also unconscious, but the parts of the preconscious can be brought into consciousness with effort. And the unconscious stuff is we'll get on to how accessible it is, because I think with parts of psychoanalysis you actually can access it, and that's part of the project. But it's much more difficult to access.
And so if I just tell me if you think I'm confusing the issue too much or not adding anything useful here, but at least my mental model of what's going on is you have kind of a seat of consciousness, or there's a sense that there's an observer within a theatre of experience. And when you're awake, that theatre of experience is, at least if your mind is functioning properly, a representation of your bodily function, your bodily sensations, your thoughts that arise, and your sensory perceptions. And then when you're dreaming, that observer is then put inside of a manifest dream content that you have this sense that you're interacting with things in this world that is not these objects in the dream world. They feel real from the observer's perspective, but when we wake up, we realize, well, it was purely interior, and those objects, say like the people you're interacting with or whatever, are not necessarily a consequence of, say, direct sensory input. It's internally generated. And yeah, I guess if I was just, because I guess I've been looking at AI and stuff recently, I kind of think of it as like the agent. The agent inside the theatre of consciousness. And when that theatre of consciousness is kind of switched off from the external world, you're then in the kind of twilight zone, or the liminal space of generated by the unconscious substructure of your mind.
I think I mean, I'll respond to that a bit. Let's leave a lot of that to later on when we talk about the structure of the mind, because I agree, this is really important, but let's set up more about dreams to give people a bit more to hold on to. But
you want to talk to them about...
to that, though, I do just want to add in, I basically agree with you, because he says that the consciousness primarily is a sensory organ.
Yeah.
And it's aroused by two things, basically. The perceptual system, so, I touch something and I can feel it, and my consciousness represents to me, or I guess to itself, what it is to be touching. What I'm touching the washing machine at the moment.
Yeah, or maybe consciousness is a representation
with a washing machine in it. And then the other thing it can respond to are, shout out to anyone watching on YouTube who can see my bottles of Mortine and stuff behind me. Other thing it responds to are excitations of pleasure and unpleasure from the psychic apparatuses, modified linguistically by the preconscious to give rise to the experience of thinking.
Yeah.
So the consciousness, it's this basically a sensory organ of subjectivity.
Yeah, or maybe a way of saying it is, consciousness is made up of sensory perceptions, both sensory perceptions where the cause is in the external world, or the cause is in the internal world, filtered through the preconscious, which we'll talk more.
Yeah.
Or maybe not filtered through the preconscious, I suppose, maybe filtered's not the right word. Maybe we can get back to that. But
we can talk about the preconscious and how it works.
Yeah, so so just before we keep on going, because it'd be good to talk about repression as part of dreams, I think the fact that, to me that has elements of Buddhism in it. If I don't know if Freud ever interacted with Buddhist philosophy, but I know that Jung did.
It would be interesting because it was certainly present in a social milieu, because Schopenhauer was responding to it a lot, and I'm pretty sure he was alive before Freud or at the time. Was it 18? Yeah, so he was around. Yeah, he was born before Freud died, 1860. Okay, so they were alive at the same time. Briefly, but Freud was pretty young. Yeah, so anyway, these ideas were known in that part of the world.
Yeah, and I think, to the degree that there's elements of what he said that are scientific and still permeate that still inform current conceptions of theories of mind, at least mainstream ones, not like panpsychism or anything, but I guess ones that are less frivolous than panpsychism. I think
panpsychist accelerationism.
Yeah,
I think the best model of the mind.
I think it's a pretty incredible that he. I don't know. It's a stunningly insightful construction of what's happening, and I can see how his experience with neurology in particular informed what he was. It took somebody, I guess, having a neurology, almost like bridging the gap between subjectivity and neurology to kind of begin to make this construction work.
Yeah, the link between neurology and Freud's model, I think, is particularly in the circuit thinking. How anyone who's done neuroscience or neurology knows most of it's memorizing various neural circuits and then learning or inferring what happens if you lesion a certain part of that.
Zap it,
yeah, or have a stroke that knocks it out. And when we talk about the specific structure of the mind, that's a circuit model as well. So that tracks.
Yeah, which we'll talk more about later, but I think that was really one of his more interesting points. Should we talk about repression in What is a Dream?
Yeah, so far, what we've set out for what's happening in a dream, you've got a wish in the unconscious, or maybe the preconscious, but let's just leave it in the unconscious for now to keep it simple. he sort of hedged whether it had to be infantile in the unconscious or not, but most of the time talked about it being an infantile wish in the unconscious. So we'll go with that. So you got your infantile wish in the unconscious. You want to get milk from some titties. You want to be warm. Whatever babies want. They're a pretty limited number of desires. So you've got that sitting in the unconscious, and that's shooting off energy. This energy's got to go somewhere. So what the energy wants, I'm saying in air quotes, is to get into the conscious, to just discharge itself. And so you've got the repressive apparatus that doesn't want to let into the conscious things that the waking mind will find distressing. That's almost all it's doing. It's looking at things that are coming up from the unconscious, from this screaming black void of the unconscious.
Yeah, basically the baby. Improperly enculturated, pure, raw animal desires.
So you've got the unconscious fiat mind. The
unconscious
has no
fiat
idea
mind
of constraint.
that just wants to print money that has an unconstrained vision of humanity.
Bitcoin conscious. And I'll stop being a fuckwit. We don't need Bitcoin talk in every episode. But anyway, so the repressive apparatus is just trying to block stuff getting into the conscious mind that it knows the conscious mind is going to find distressing. And so what does the unconscious do about this is it tries to take this wish energy, and then dress it up in things that let it express itself, but indirectly. Things that the conscious mind and the preconscious won't immediately clock as being expressions of wanting to murder your father or something, and will let through into the manifest content of a dream. Repression can manifest in a huge number of ways, and I think, well, if you talk about unfalsifiability, repression is the part of Freud's theory which I think is the biggest offender when it comes to that, because you not remembering a bit of a dream, that's repression. You not wanting to talk about a bit of a dream to your analyst, that's repression. You misremembering a bit of your dream, that's repression. You not agreeing with Freud's theory, that's repression. It's just actually anything can be repression. And I guess this is more a user hazard. So you could be a psychoanalyst who just wants the patient to have some particular problem, and you're just going to keep throwing repression at them until you get the answer you want.
And lead the witness the entire time.
Yeah. If you're doing it in good faith, I think you can get around the problem of repression being basically anything, or can be read into basically anything. But I think that is a real risk with this form of analysis.
Yeah, and it's good to also just to mention what are some of the sources of repression, like why. A big one is taboo.
Yeah.
So that, he has an entire book on taboo specifically. And I guess a part of his problem situation as well, to loop back to that, is he was writing in continental Europe and the UK during the, would you say, like late Victorian era?
Well, he was writing in Vienna. He only moved to the UK, I think, in 38 or 39, because he was Jewish and was basically running away from the Nazis.
Yeah, and so, but my point being that famously, that sort of 19th century, early 20th century Europe, full of very intense taboos, especially sexual taboos. And it seems to me like in another culture that had different taboos, a Freud equivalent from, I don't know, the axolotl clan in central Mexico or something.
Emperor penguins in Antarctica.
Yeah, would have come up with maybe a theory of repression and wish fulfillment, but not have had such an emphasis on sexual taboos. Might have had an emphasis on, I don't know, if it's a highly sexual society where there's lots of nakedity and stuff, less emphasis on that. But maybe if it's a hyper peaceful society where you can't argue or be combative, maybe the repression would have been repressing violent and combative subconscious urges. And so
all of the porn they watch that they will never tell their friends about are like people arguing with each other, getting into really, really heated political discussions.
Yeah. So I guess not to bring too much of a criticism into Freud's work, but into our conversation right now. But it seems to me as though his particular fixation on sexuality might have been more a response to his particular culture, and if he could have found a more abstract theory that could have accounted for different types of repression in different cultures, that would have been a real innovation, but still very insightful thing for him to try to get to.
I may as well bring it in here because I think it is relevant, although it's not within this book. His idea of childhood sexuality and bisexuality, I'm pretty sure this idea of his was already published and already in existence when he wrote this book. If there are Freud scholars listening and the idea of polymorphous perversity came about after the interpretation of dreams, I apologize. I'm pretty sure it was already. So I think it's useful in understanding his idea of childhood urges and the repression of them by bearing in mind that he talks about childhood sexuality. So he says childhood sexuality exists basically from the get-go, but it takes a while to turn into the form of sexuality that we as adults would recognize. He describes it as polymorphous perversity, meaning basically it's this libidinal energy just spraying out in all directions and going to latch on to stuff that as adults we don't think of as sexual unless you have some sort of paraphilia. And it tends to go through stages in development. So you start out as in the oral phase. So there's an oral fixation, which he links to, say, nursing from your mother or from a wet nurse. That goes on to an anal phase, so an obsession with anality, and so it's things to do with defecation. He links in the father and control to anality as well, I think. I'm not exactly sure how he does that. I'm sure there's some convoluted link there. And basically the development of sexuality in children is a development from this polymorphous perversity just spraying in all directions into a genital, so the genital phase comes after the anal phase, a genital heterosexual sexuality in an adult. And that's what he thought of as an adult sexuality. And that's also, he considered, I think, children or people to be fundamentally bisexual. You're just attracted to whatever, fuck whatever, play the whole field. And I'm not sure whether it's innate or most likely societal, you land on that heterosexual genital sexuality, where the genitals are the primary focus of sexuality and sexual attraction. And so from that you can see how repressions arise. So they're repressing, say, you're a man, and you begin with this innate bisexuality. Well, they're going to start repressing attraction to men. So that already is a childhood, like a childhood wish, basically, that is being repressed and subject to repression. Maybe the orality and anality is also going to be repressed because those things are still there and they're still shooting off psychic energy. But because your adult sexuality has a genital focus, like, that's what's going to be let through into the conscious. The other stuff won't be. So you can already see in that sort of development how Freud saw sexual impulses being repressed.
So, in summary, you start off as a little feral Jack Russell that'll fuck anything that it sees.
Yeah.
And then through intense
But not even
socialization.
fuck, because that's a genital that's a genital sexuality.
A little feral Jack Russell that will throw up on your carpet, then eat its own vomit, and then shit everywhere, and then fuck something. Fuck like a teddy bear or something. That's how you start.
That's the full spectrum animal experience. Orality, anality, and the genital sexuality in one.
and then through intense psychosexual I suppose enculturation
by the repressive apparatus makes it only
by the fiat repressive system, you then become a little US dollar cuck, and you start just being heterosexual and having vanilla sex instead of, fucking the couches.
Exactly. And this is what Bitcoin fixes.
No more feral little Jack Russells. We're getting rid of them in the new Bitcoin regime. Anyways, why don't we move on to formation? And you've got a quote there. I'll let you read that. I'm just.
I read that quote. I opened up this section with that.
Oh yeah, that one. Okay, so I'm just going to grab a glass of water.
Yeah, no worries. I'll talk about the factors in forming dreams. So, these unconscious wishes have a few different strategies for getting past censorship. One of them is displacement. So, displacement is shifting the energy of a dream. So, say the place where there's the most psychic energy in a dream, the most potent bit of it, maybe that's something that is going to get immediately repressed. It's going to immediately get censored. And the unconscious, in some sense, knows this. So the unconscious does seem to have some sort of idea or sense of what the preconscious is going to censor. So it's going to displace the center of psychic intensity from something that might be distressing to the conscious mind to something innocuous. And oftentimes it'll do this. It'll displace energy to just trivia from that day. So say you went to the shops and bought some, I'll say apples, not bananas, because Freud would have a field day with something as phallic as banana. But you bought some apples. So it's just not, it's not psychically salient or anything like that. So your unconscious will go, great, displace all of my energy from an incest dream or an incest wish, which the conscious mind will find distressing, to that memory from today of going to buy apples. So that's going to be, that's where the energy is going to be displaced. Another way that dreams are formed, and also a way that censorship is evaded, is through this process of condensation. Condensation is basically compressing a large number of dream thoughts, remembering that dream thoughts are those memories, those affects, those ideas and so on that sit in the unconscious, compressing lots of these into a relatively spare number of dream content pieces. So dream content is what is the manifest content of a dream. It's what you actually remember dreaming. It's the pictures that you see when you're asleep. And condensation is important because it feeds into Freud's free associative model of working out what's going on in a dream. So some people, if they have any familiarity with how Freudian free association works, you try to relax your critical faculties, your judgment. Think of something from a dream and then say immediately just the next thing that comes into your head, and then to say the next thing that comes into your head, and you just keep doing that and build this long chain of associations. Why are you doing this? Because I think you can think of he talks it in one point about dream thoughts being smashed into a dream and forming dream content as almost this like a glacial or an ice flow just smashing together into a smaller space. You've got all of these different things and different memories that the dream is pulling on to put together, and they're related by how they fit with the wish being expressed. They don't have to logically relate to each other or anything like that, because logic is more a function of the waking mind. But they might have some sort of aesthetic similarity or some sort of symbolic similarity relating back to the wish. And in condensation, you might have something. How to express it? It's almost, a condensation is sort of a point of intersection between lots and lots and lots of different trains of thought in a dream that's happening unconsciously. And that really, really intense intersection, it might be a particular memory, it might be a figure of someone who represents, say, 5 different people that are important in your dream, but is appearing as one person. It might be an injection, it might be the name of a place that you visit in a dream, which, in chasing the etymology of this particular thing you work out, actually refers to 3 or 4 different other things in a dream. Those are condensations. Those are areas of compression of lots and lots of different dream thoughts expressed as the one object in the dream content.
Yeah,
and that's
I think
another
that's a
way.
good way of thinking of it is essentially symbolic compression or overloading. Yeah.
Yeah, he called it overdetermination.
Yeah.
Where a single thing appearing in a dream to you can refer to so many different dream thoughts in the unconscious. And this is basically a way for the unconscious to smuggle into the consciousness things that the consciousness would have censored or that it would find distressing. And then symbolization is another way for representing a repressed wish. So an interesting thing about symbolism is that it's related to representability in dreams. So we'll get into regression later, but it's enough for now to say that dreams heavily emphasize particularly images because of the way that dream energy can enter into the consciousness. One way it can do that is through stimulating the senses. And it really likes stimulating the visual system. That's a way that things can be represented in dreams more easily than through other modalities. So you get a lot of visual symbols in dreams. An important note too historically is that at the time, even now, you'll have books of dream symbols where people will say, oh, if you see this in a dream, it means that. While Freud did tentatively offer some symbols that might be common to many people, he had a section on typical dreams where he talks about, say, a dream that many people have had of appearing naked before people and then not being able to move. And I think he said that that's a relation to childhood exhibitionism. Or a dream of falling, which in women is almost invariably sexual because it's some wish to be a fallen woman, or flying dreams. In the second edition of this book, published in 1909, he went more heavy on these symbols. It just basically like listing phallic objects and saying, oh, you're dreaming about penises.
Yeah.
We didn't read that edition. But he considered symbols to be largely individual, or maybe a function of living in a particular society. He wasn't, say, Jungian with Jung's ideas of a collective unconscious expressing these sort of universal symbols in a dream. That's a pretty big point of departure between the two of them.
Yeah, and it's interesting that therefore when we talk about the dream interpretation process, I suppose the underlying role of the psychoanalysis then in a Freudian psychoanalysis as opposed to a Jungian psychoanalysis is guiding the patient through understanding their own individual symbolism, within the context of their own life, and less so a Jungian is going to bring in a whole bunch of cultural, universal symbolism to, I suppose, aid in the interpretation by giving the participant or the patient, oh, well, this symbol means this in this culture, or if you abstract it more across cultures, it might mean this. And so maybe that can aid in your dream analysis insofar as you can find the intersection between your individual experience and some meaning of the symbol within the collective unconscious. Whereas the Freudian approach is much more, an investigation into your own childhood, your own recent experiences, your own latent memories of learning something or acquiring knowledge, and then constructing a map of your individual symbols.
Which speaks to a really fundamental difference between Freud and Jung. And then I'll get to the final, one of the final components of forming a dream. But it's that Jung and Jungians put a lot of emphasis on the manifest content of a dream. So what does the dream look like? What are the pictures? Those are in and of themselves important.
Meaningful, yeah.
Whereas for Freud and Freudians, the manifest content of a dream is important only insofar as it points to the latent content of a dream, which is where the real meaning is.
Yeah.
And that, that ties into what you said a lot. And that's a huge difference between the two schools of thought.
It's huge, and just as an aside, it's fascinating as well.
Yeah. Because my intuitive position would be, well, why doesn't the manifest content matter? Like, perhaps it does make a difference. And that does seem to be a big assumption on Freud's part, that basically all the manifest content is a result of dream distortion, of this process that we're talking about now, of how the unconscious hides itself and sneaks into the conscious.
Yeah. And on that note, I really do like, I don't know if it's just this particular translation or other English translations, and therefore I obviously don't know if condensation is the best word of, like if you looked at his original writing. But I feel like I get what he's saying. You have these pre-linguistic, subconscious processes and ideas that, like, moisture on a window, condense into specific droplets, and you don't see the moisture in the air until it's condensed into a droplet. And I quite like that visual. It's like you have this what would you call it, like a what is that thing it's like a fog or a you have a miasma of desires and wishes, and that miasma condenses into explicit symbols in the dream state. I think, at least, I don't know if it's true or whatever, but you know how sometimes you talk about, you just really like the aesthetics of an idea sometimes, and you don't care less about whether it's true. I think that idea is so cool.
It's a very, very nice image. A very nice way to express it.
Yeah. So, did you talk about displacement whilst I was gone, or have you not spoken about displacement?
Yeah, I talked about displacement.
Okay,
Just
cool.
need to talk about secondary revision.
Yeah, cool.
Because that's the final bit of how dreams are formed, or how the experience of a dream, the manifest content, is formed. We will get on to talking about the preconscious later. It's just enough now to know that while you're dreaming, one of the preconscious's roles, in addition to suppressing or stopping distressing thoughts to the conscious mind, getting through to the consciousness from the unconscious, it's also to keep you asleep when you are sleeping. And one way it does this is by, again, preventing really distressing things getting into your dreams, which might wake you up, but also by preventing too much absurdity. So Freud says that if a dream's sufficiently absurd, you're just going to wake up.
Yeah. Or
And so what secondary revision does, secondary revision is operating more or less according to the rules of waking life or your waking mind. And it's watching the dream. And if it notices that something's getting really absurd, it'll add in something like, this is only a dream, to the manifest content of a dream, to calm down the dreamer, to contextualize the absurdity. What it'll also do is, if you have these disjointed bits of dreams different scenes that don't seem to link together, secondary revision is this process of adding logical connections in between them to relieve the absurdity. But these are quickly forgotten, which is why oftentimes when you think back to a dream, what you remember is just this series of seemingly disconnected scenes. So that's that final part of the 4 factors of dream formation, or of modifying the latent dream thoughts and rendering in them via dream work into the manifest content of a dream, the dream content.
So just intuitively, the way that I feel when we talk about these 4 stages, condensation, displacement, symbolism, and secondary revision, I can kind of see what he's talking about. And
Yeah. It makes sense.
In a way, I don't feel as though it's totally unreasonable. And for example, with displacement, I can think of dreams just off the top of my head where it seems like displacement is happening, where, say, I've got a specific anxiety in a specific relationship in my life, say, I don't know, an argument with my girlfriend or whatever. And when I have a dream, I have that same sense of anxiety about that argument, except it's now, some conflict with a different person or something like that,
Yeah.
But when I wake up, I know that the explicit person that I'm having the argument with, that's a completely absurd argument in the dream, it has the same flavor or emotional signature as the anxiety from the disagreement with my girlfriend or whatever.
Yeah.
So that sort of stuff, I feel like
it's not frivolous. I think it's a meaningful attempt to explain what's going on.
And it feels at least that it contains truth, a lot of truth. Even if the specifics and some of the stuff around repression is maybe not so, doesn't feel true. And I know, truth can't be reduced to a feeling, but at least intuitively it feels like he's onto something worthwhile with those 4 components.
So how about we jump from that to how to interpret a dream. So the point of dream interpretation is you're looking for what wish is being expressed. Like, that's at least the proximate goal. The further goal is to, from establishing which wish is being expressed, you might be able to relieve certain repressions in your mind that could be contributing to psychic or physical symptoms. Because when we get into the structure of the mind, we'll get more into the energy economy of the mind. But for now, it's enough to know that certain desires are generating energy, or certain wishes are generating psychic energy. And an accumulation of psychic energy in the unconscious past a certain point is unpleasurable. And the unconscious wants to discharge this energy somewhere. And if it's being constantly repressed, it builds up, and then discharges in some weird way. And that can cause what we would today call mental illness. Mental illness, it can also cause, I guess, conversion disorder is a mental illness. It causes physical symptoms as well. So what you're trying to do is ease that repression and let that energy be blown off or dissipated in a healthier way or a more adaptive way. So that's why you're analysing these dreams and looking for that wish. How do you analyse them? So one is free association, and this is something that I think a lot of people are aware of, or one of the first things they think of when they think of Freudian psychoanalysis. You, the analyst, and sitting on the couch with the analyst behind you, and you're relaxing your faculties of critical judgment and just saying the first thing that comes into your head. So when the analyst says rocket, you say penis. When they say cigar, you say penis. When they say banana, you say penis.
When they say Mortine, you say penis.
Penis.
When they say Blue Yeti, you say penis.
Yeah, exactly. So it's just all roads lead to Rome. Which, as an aside, Freud was obsessed with in this book. He's just obsessed with Rome and going to Rome. He really wanted to go to Rome.
Yeah. Yeah.
He just keeps having dreams about going to Rome. And then in the dream realizes that he's never been to Rome and he can't be in Rome now and gets disappointed.
We've all been there, haven't we?
Yeah.
Damn, I'm not in Rome. I think the way that I understood dream interpretation at a high level is Freud's attempt at an inverse operation. Starting from the conscious, getting down into the unconscious and retrieving the latent meaning. And his theory or his supposition is that in doing so, you will help the patient, I suppose, release. If a neurosis is either a blockage of psychic energy or an inappropriate channeling of psychic energy, then it's almost like you're a psychic plumber and you're using dream interpretation to go in there and
unblock that repression. Unblock
it or rechannel it in a healthier direction and therefore alleviate or cure the conscious and physical manifestations of the neurosis by getting into the underlying root cause in the unconscious.
Yeah. And so with something like free association, what Freud says is that these chains of association are in your unconscious, which is why they're expressed in the process of condensation in a particular image in your dream. And so you, by undergoing a process of free association, beginning with some image in the dream while you're awake with your analyst, is actually very meaningful. It's not random. It's not according to some completely foreign logic to the dream. You're still expressing these underlying connections that were expressed in condensation in the dream. And you might come upon connections that you hadn't thought of before. You might remember other parts of the dream. And he says, remembering these bits of the dream is really important, because if you'd forgotten it, it was more repressed. And that means it's closer to expressing the latent content of the dream than things you could more readily remember. So you can do free association. Spoken words in dreams, it's something interesting, where he said, if someone says something out loud in a dream, that is verbatim something that you have heard in waking life. It might be a few different things you've heard in waking life smashed together, but it's something you've heard in waking life, and you should look for the context, the time and place in which this thing was said to shed more light on the dream, why this particular memory was selected by the unconscious to evade censorship and what it might mean. Another thing that is that's interesting is that there's no logic in the unconscious, or at least not in the sense that in waking life we would think of logic. Any apparent logic expressed within a dream, such as something being mathematically correct, someone adds together two numbers and you get the right answer, or someone inferring what time of day it is by where the sun is in the sky, some sort of logical operation. This is an artifact of the structure or the content of a dream thought that was used to express the wish to the conscious mind. you can infer some sort of logical connection by how things occur in dreams. So Freud said two things being related can be expressed by simultaneity or close sequence in a dream, or cause and effect expressed by the minor part, like a prelude, compared to the major part of a dream, the bulk of a dream. He says also that either or propositions don't exist in dreams, and no doesn't really mean anything to a dream.
And
a
Ayn
dream
Rand
doesn't
would
really
be very disappointed with that. Freud clearly wasn't a Randian.
No, he definitely was not a Randian. Yeah, a dream doesn't acknowledge constraints.
Yeah.
Either or statements are just presented together. Like the two possibilities, which are in waking life mutually exclusive, will just be presented next to each other.
Yeah. This is both an apple and not an apple.
Yeah, exactly. It's A and not A. Ayn Rand is crying in a corner.
Thomas Sowell as well.
Yeah. Yeah. There are also actually affects in dreams. So some people, I'm sure everyone's had the experience of dreaming where you might see something that should be very distressing, say a loved one who's dead, and in waking life would be distressing, but your affect is just completely disconnected from it. So you'll be feeling something that doesn't make sense. So you might be totally indifferent, you might feel happy, you might be interested in something unrelated. And Freud says that affects in dreams are real fragments of dream thoughts made into dream content, but it might be an affect from a different dream thought smashed together with images from a different dream thought and all put together, and so they don't necessarily match up. Or if the affect is from the same dream thought as some of the images are, the preconscious seeks to suppress that affect a bit so you don't wake up.
Can we just loop back around just to clarify again?
Yeah.
I might even myself be getting slightly confused. Dream thought versus dream content. The dream content is the condensed images, like the actual explicit.
The dream content's the manifest stuff. It's what you're aware of.
Saber-toothed clown that's chasing you down.
Exactly.
In the dream.
Yeah.
And then the dream thought is the underlying wish or whatever.
The dream thoughts are those things in your unconscious that
are being condensed into.
The wish is collecting and pulling from and putting together to try to get itself past censorship into the conscious mind.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're fine. So we've got three major things. Then we've got dream thought, dream content, of which there is manifest dream content and latent dream content. Can we just get a reminder, Jack, of latent dream content?
Yeah. So dream thoughts and dream content, and then the manifest and latent content of a dream map onto each other. So the latent content is the stuff going on in the unconscious. It's that wish fulfillment that's drawing on dream thoughts to try to get past the censorship into the conscious mind. When it's in the conscious mind, that's the manifest content of a dream. The bit of the dream that manifests itself to the consciousness that you're aware of and is dream content. So you can basically just match together latent content and dream thought together, unconscious stuff, and smash together manifest content and dream content as the conscious stuff.
Yeah.
Like the experience of the dream.
Yeah.
Yeah, these are terminology things which they sound similar, so they're easy to confuse. Even like getting the terminology precisely right in the context of this podcast is important, so people aren't just given completely the wrong information. But for people's own mental model of how this is working, so long as they intuitively understand how bits fit together, the precise names of things are probably less important.
Yeah.
What about the structure of the mind?
Is there anything, just before we move on, is there anything major, other effects in dreams, newly remembered parts of a dream?
There is other stuff. So
important
in this episode, we cannot summarize or present everything in this book. So is there more stuff about what's in dreams, how they're formed? Yes, there's a lot in this book. But we're trying to hit the most important points so that people can have a functional knowledge of what Freud's saying in the interpretation of dreams.
You've got a note here, which I guess we'll just touch on, which is, why is he doing this? Which we already briefly touched on before. But to make it really, really explicit, like he sees this as essentially a therapeutic method.
Yeah, this is clinical.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the structure of the mind, and this, I believe he wrote this before he wrote later works where he introduced the id, the superego, and the ego.
Yeah, this is quite a bit before
if you've heard those terms before, those are Freudian terms, and they've been very influential. And people sometimes still use them, even if they're not using them in a disciplined, strict way that a well-versed Freudian would use them. They're using them at least in broad brushstrokes to mean roughly what Freud was talking about. The superego being socialization, essentially, and so forth. So this is almost like you can see those concepts in this structure, in this topological map of the mind from this book. However, I guess he hasn't refined his theory of mind to the point that he's using those terms yet in this book.
Yeah, and it's also important to note, as Freud develops, I don't think this model of the unconscious, preconscious, and conscious, which he sets out in the interpretation of dreams, was superseded by the ego, superego, id. Instead, those things are set on top of each other. So, for example, I think both the ego and the superego have conscious and preconscious components.
Yep.
And then the id is totally within the unconscious. So they sit over each other, but we'll leave the later bits to the side for this episode.
Yeah, we won't talk about those. I guess for what it's worth, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, but it might be better to think of the concepts that we're discussing now, unconscious, preconscious, and conscious, as structural. They are the structure of these kind of three different realms or three different theaters of the mind. So the mind is this overall thing that has a structure, conscious, preconscious, and conscious. And it also has, I suppose, for lack of a better word, functional elements. And those functional elements are the id, super ego, and ego. And those functional elements, or maybe high-level subprocesses largely reside within one of these structural elements, but it's not necessarily a one-to-one mapping. So there might be elements of the ego and superego which sort of cross between the conscious and preconscious.
Yeah.
And so they are separate. And in this particular book, he's talking about purely the functional aspect. I'm sorry, purely the structural or topological sub-theaters of the mind.
Yeah. So let's set out the three big bits of the mind first, and then we can talk about how they relate to each other. So you've got the conscious part of the mind, which we talked a bit about what it did earlier in the episode. So it's the bit that calls itself I. It's the bit that is aware of listening to the podcast you're listening to right now. And Freud says it's a sensory organ of internal affects and sensations, arousable by external sensations, seeing something, smelling something, and so on, or your internal states, those affects spat up out of the unconscious through the preconscious. At the very end of the book too, he says that you can consciously direct the flow of energy in the psi systems overcome the unpleasure principle, which we'll talk about in a moment, in choosing to energize an aversive memory, which I found very interesting. So there's actually maybe the possibility here of him introducing free will, so the conscious can actually do stuff, so act rather than just receive sensations and construct a subjectivity based on receiving these sensations. But there was a very brief mention of that. I'm not sure if he expands on that in later works or not, but I just thought that was cool. So a step down the iceberg in this structure, you have the preconscious. What the preconscious is, one of the functions it serves is to act as this screen between the unconscious and the conscious. The preconscious is the bit that's censoring. The preconscious is the bit that when the unconscious, some unconscious infantile desire with no concept of waking world logic, with no concept of what Freud calls reality. So just the rules that govern everyday life. Like, I can't fly. The bodies fall towards the earth. The unconscious doesn't give a shit. It wants to fly. The preconscious is filtering that, going, no, no, stopping those desires from getting through into the conscious and filtering them, repressing them. The preconscious is the organ of repression and where censorship lies. It does other things too. So apparently it's also responsible for voluntary movement, attention, memories that aren't presently conscious. So they're not in your mind right now, but you can bring them to mind very easily. They're not things that are distressing. It's what did I eat for breakfast? I wasn't thinking of that until I just said, what did I eat for breakfast? And I remember what I had. So those are sort of
retrievable memories.
Yeah, preconscious memories are easily retrievable because they're not, I guess they can be distressing. You can remember something distressing happened. So if a loved one died, it's not that suddenly you just blank that out and you're completely unaware that they've died because it's a distressing memory. But I suppose in some way maybe it's not distressing in the same way that some taboo from an unconscious infantile desire would be. Your desire for, so what Freud said, your desire to have sex with your mother is highly distressing to the conscious mind, and through the Oedipus complex, he says, is basically present in everyone. That's the sort of thing that's not getting through the preconscious. But I guess other distressing memories or drives are allowed through, but they're distressing in an acceptable way. I'm not totally sure what makes certain things just invisible to the consciousness.
Yeah.
And what makes, I guess, more things that are distressing in a pedestrian way accessible to it.
Yeah.
I'm not totally sure. Maybe it really has to do with taboo. Maybe something becomes taboo if it is repressed in that way. Or maybe it's repressed in that way because it's taboo. I'm not sure which direction it works in.
And for people who really know Freud, I'm probably misrepresenting him, but maybe you could say a very clean definition of what is a taboo is that an idea within a particular society that exists predominantly within the unconscious and within each individual is systematically repressed in the preconscious mind. And, in one society that might be having sex with your mother. In another one, it might be
that's totally
homosexuality.
Cool. They don't,
yeah. And so then taboo actually has a very straightforward mapping into Freud's topological structure of the mind. It's those ideas that are contained by the preconscious in the subconscious or in the unconscious.
Yeah, perhaps it is. So Freud does give special place to infantile memories, particularly before the age of 3, he says, in one point. infantile memories, infantile desires, these are extremely psychically energetic objects of the unconscious. And he says that wish fulfillments in dreams are basically always of these infantile wishes. And they're not accessible to or understandable by the preconscious. So perhaps that's the distinction, and where deeply felt taboos come from. It's these infantile desires, whereas distressing things like the death of your parents that's not rooted in these infantile desires or aversions or wishes. So the preconscious can grab onto them even if they are aversive.
Yeah.
Maybe that's it.
Maybe.
But,
yeah, and it's important to know, I don't know if I can't remember the earlier conversation. Maybe we didn't say too explicitly, but when Freud is talking about energy, I think, well, at least my understanding of it.
We didn't say explicitly because we were saving it for later on.
But I kind of interpret it as almost like a metaphor, and he didn't have better language to use. And maybe if he were living today, he would use a different metaphor or a different language. But for what it's worth, it's non-physical energy in the psychic systems.
Yeah.
And memories and so forth, wishes, have more or less causal impact on the person's psyche and behavior to the degree that they are energized or de-energized.
Yeah. Yeah. What else does the preconscious do? We've already mentioned that it seeks to keep the dreamer asleep. So interestingly, in dreams, there actually needs to be some agreement between the unconscious and preconscious. So
yeah,
things getting let through by the preconscious are things that the preconscious is happy are going to keep the dreamer asleep, but they're also energies that the unconscious is wanting to discharge according to the unpleasure principle, which again, I know I keep saying this, we'll get onto. So that it's funny too with this structure he has of the mind. A lot of stuff happening is basically a compromise between these different systems that don't necessarily have the same. Calling them goals is maybe a bit too agentic or ascribes too much agency or subjecthood to them, but because I think them together almost form the subject, but they have differing aims in some sense. And so much that happens is a compromise between them. Yeah. Or some equilibrium between them, maybe more, because I'd say the unconscious I don't think has much sense of compromising, although interestingly does seem to modify itself to conform to the preconscious or to get around it. So it has some sense of limitation then in that regard. Anyway, unconscious. Infantile drives, instincts, wishes, memories that are particularly infantile ones that are too charged or unpleasant to enter into consciousness unmodified. Totally selfish.
That'd be very distressing.
Yeah. No concept of waking reality. So it's wishes the conscious mind would often regard as irrational. And I guess one way to think about it is the preconscious is able to charge or remove charge from certain memories.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
And if it gives them charge, they become conscious.
Yeah.
And if it takes it away or cuts them off, they become unconscious or slip into the unconscious. So it's not like the unconscious is this like a physical area that these things are in and they can't get in or out of. It's maybe you can even think of it as elevation. Past a certain level of elevation, the conscious mind can see things, and the preconscious to some extent is the arbiter of that elevation of a particular memory or a wish or a desire.
Yeah, essentially Freud is saying that the preconscious is serving a very important regulatory role.
Yeah, extremely important. Yeah.
You know, if you kind of imagine that you could do an excision, just remove a part of a person's psyche, and you took out the preconscious in Freud's in the model that Freud is putting forward in the interpretation of dreams, you would basically then just be overwhelmed by highly psychically energetic thoughts, dream images if you're asleep, memories that are extremely distressing.
Well, you become a
probably
child in some
meld-
ways, because Freud
yeah.
seems to think that very young children don't really have much preconscious activity.
Yeah.
That comes
So-
a little bit later.
Become childlike and or really distressed.
Yeah, because if anyone has any
Through all
experience
the
of children,
taboos.
they have no sense of deferring gratification. I mean, if a 6-month-old child wants milk now, they're going to start screaming, and they'll stop when they get it. They're not planning out, oh, maybe I'll get it in 10 seconds. It's now. They want it now.
So you have
They don't have this sense of embarrassment, so they'll happily just shit themselves in your lap.
Yeah. So you have the
no preconscious activity.
the conscious mind is really taking command of executive functions and delayed gratification. The unconscious mind doesn't do that.
Yeah, it does not care.
It's the fiat mind, and then as Jack said,
The fiat mind.
and then you
The
have
fiat mind, the pre-conscious is the Bitcoin mind, and they're fighting over the consciousness.
and
So I think
think
it's less adversarial in
it's not
Freud's
adversarial,
framework.
but it's
I
more
prefer our way.
regular. It's more like, as we said, there's this energy system, and there's different structural subsystems within the energy system, and it's almost like the the unconscious is this vast. Maybe think about it kind of like a ship, like a steam powered ship. You know, most of the engine stuff is in the hull, and then you have this, like, the captain is sitting up at the wheel of the ship and has access to some instruments to direct the ship, and there's some translation subsystems between the engine and the hull of the ship that's producing all this massive amounts of energy, and in order to control that and mediate between the massive amounts of energy in the hull and the engine in the hull and the fine-grained, explicit, intentional navigation of the captain, how fast do we go, which direction are we going, there's mechanisms in between.
Yeah.
And that's sort of what the preconscious is doing. It's this intermediary layer that is helping regulate the relationship between the massive amounts of sort of unrefined energy in the unconscious and what is happening in the theater of consciousness.
Yeah, because the unconscious it's not just a liability.
No,
It also does important stuff. So Freud says basically all your psychic energy, or all the energy within your psyche and your mind, is from the unconscious and from unconscious desires, which are really energetically active, spraying out this energy. So without it, just nothing would happen.
Yeah. In fact,
Everything on top of the consciousness, like the preconscious or the conscious. So the conscious, its job is to be subjectively aware of what's going on internally and externally. It's also this bit sitting between the sensory experience of the outside world and the sensory experience of the inside world. It's this organ between them. And the preconscious is this bit there to, I guess, spare the consciousness from the full blast of unconscious energy.
And you could ask the question of what would happen if you removed one of these systems, if you or ablated it. If you ablated the unconscious, at least in this model,
I think you'd just be dead.
you'd just be dead. Like there isn't. They are dependent upon the unconscious because that's sort of the source of energy. Inversely, maybe you could imagine an entity that has had its consciousness and pre-consciousness ablated, and it isn't having a subjective experience necessarily, or at least not a really explicit one with, distinct objects of a book, a table, and so forth, but it does just have a mass amount of, I guess, what we might see as instinctual or automatic reactions to its environment, like an animal or something like that.
In that case, because you would have... We'll talk about the energy economy eventually, but the unconscious, where would it discharge its energy? I guess into the motor system via the
Directly into the
preconscious.
motor system, yeah.
because it wouldn't be able to discharge energy into the perceptual system. But that's a funny one. You eventually would probably just get an explosion of psychic energy because it's not able to discharge enough of it.
Yeah, or maybe you said, what is the animal mind? Maybe. I don't know. I'm kind of going out on a limb here. You might say, well, it's basically just an unconscious with some perceptual input. Like the unconscious is essentially just interacting directly with external and internal perceptual input, and is just reacting without any intermediary layers to those things.
I guess this is just like minutiae of how Freud sets it out, because I thought the perceptual unit is the conscious, because that's the perceptual unit that roots that.
I guess
that stuff
if
into
I
the
use a different term instead of perceptual unit, like electrochemical input from like the peripheral nervous system.
Because what would it be? Because if it's not getting perceptual input through the consciousness, it's just this aperceptual desiring machine with no link to the outside.
I suppose we'd be saying
world.
they don't have any qualia.
Yeah,
there's no subjectivity to the relationship between electrochemical signals from the peripheral nervous system into the unconscious animal mind. So there's nothing being perceived, but there is input into it, and the unconscious animal mind is just reacting to it and directing energy in and out of the motor system in response to that. But there's no subjectivity necessarily associated with it. I'm going out on a limb here.
Yeah. What about we talk about the energy economy and how... So we've set out these three bits of this system, and now how are they interacting? So Freud says it's through basically the build-up and discharge of psychic energy. I'm not sure whether it was now, whether it was later. In certain places he says it's libidinal energy.
Libido.
So he based a lot on sex. So you've got the unconscious, these infantile wishes which build up energy, and energy past a certain threshold is unpleasurable. And so the unconscious wants to discharge these energies somewhere. And energy discharge meaning wish fulfillment, basically. So it wants a return of the first time this particular wish was fulfilled, or that's what forms the wish. So you've got your baby, for the very first time ever, it experiences some novel pleasurable stimulus that forms a wish, and that wish in the unconscious is just, I want this particular thing again. And then I guess for the rest of your life, you've just always got that thing shooting off energy, wanting the return of that. There are two directions that this discharge can go. Like, I guess the two endpoints as it propagates out through the unconscious. One is back to the perceptual system, and it tries to stimulate those perceptions again to relive the experience of having that wish fulfilled. Freud says in waking life, and we'll get to progression and regression in a moment, that's suppressed. And if something goes wrong and unconscious desires are just stimulating that all the time, that's psychosis, which if an animal is to be interacting with the world and fulfilling its desires in that way is not useful. The other way it can go is, I guess, the other way it can reach the consciousness. The other way it gets into the consciousness is through the preconscious and the motor system. And what the preconscious is doing is it's sitting there as this way for discharged unconscious psychic energy to hit the consciousness in an ordered way and in a verbalized, we would call it rational way. I guess the conscious mind would call it rational way. But also to delay that gratification so that it can be gratified in the world through the motor system. So you've got the infantile wish, I'm hungry. Without access to that preconscious conscious circuit through the motor system, the unconscious would be, I guess, happy to just keep stimulating that memory through the perceptual system of the first time you ate, and just keep doing that till you die. Whereas an animal needs some way, some mechanism for getting that desire and then enacting it in the world, which is what this secondary process of that circuit from the unconscious, preconscious, conscious, and motor system does. The preconscious in all of this has its own desires. So the unconscious desire is to discharge energy by fulfilling a desire. The preconscious also doesn't want too much energy because it also experiences that energetic overload as unpleasure. So what it does is it just tries to withdraw energy from certain unconscious circuits that are causing unpleasure, say by just spitting out taboo wishes into the preconscious, trying to reach consciousness, and the preconsciousness is screening them. Freud also says in one part of the book that with certain very intense, very taboo infantile desires, the preconscious just cuts them off and becomes totally unaware of them. And that doesn't mean these desires go away. It means that they'll find their way into consciousness through those processes that we noted earlier in dreams, or through displacement or condensation or symbolization. But it can also just cut them loose and say, you know what, there's too much Oedipus talk from the unconscious. I'm not going to deal with this anymore. just cutting off that channel of communication. So you've kind of got the conscious and the preconscious and the unconscious, both with their goal in some way of getting stuff into the conscious mind so that that energy can be discharged. So those are the drives. I guess onto that, we then have these ideas of progression and regression. And it ties into dreams in an important way. So progression is the energy flow during waking life. It's where the preconscious censorship is very intense, because what does the preconscious want? Because it's involved in motor control, it actually doesn't want particularly discursive thought. It wants, okay, there's a piece of food over there. What are the motor steps to get me from here to there and to eat the food, for example? It wants like a very straightforward, it's quite verbalized, he says. So the preconscious is highly verbal, but basically to get you from here to there and fulfill some concrete goal. And this occurs according to waking logic, so a logic that you have built up from experience in the waking world. You have an idea of gravity, you have an idea of not being able to move through solid objects, you have an idea of, I guess it follows from gravity, that you can't fly, and so on. When you're asleep, the flow of energy in your mind changes. It goes into what he calls regression, where several things happen. One, the preconscious censorship relaxes a bit. For Freud says he's not quite sure why, but he theorizes it might just be for saving energy, saving mental energy, so you don't tire yourself out by just always having to censor the unconscious to a very high degree. But I don't think I mentioned this, but like in many parts of the book, he actually says, I don't really know why this is the case, I need to look into it more, which I do respect when he'll just say, I don't know. But the unconscious mind, the unconscious energy kind of just spreads out through the unconscious. Instead of just always trying to go through the preconscious up to the conscious, it also starts moving backwards towards the perceptual system. So in waking life, in progression, your conscious mind perceives things in the world through your five senses. That energetically goes into the unconscious and then runs through the unconscious, runs up through the preconscious, and then back into the conscious in that loop. That's the progression loop. When you're asleep, you're not getting sensory inputs. So he says you get regression. So your unconscious energy goes back towards the perceptual system, as well as trying to get to consciousness through the preconscious. And it's particularly in stimulating the perceptual system that you get a lot of the imagery in dreams. He says, and this is something that I wasn't sure of either, it's unclear why unconscious desires will conform to preconscious censorship, even in approaching the perceptual system, which, at least in Freud's model, is not gate-kept by the preconscious. He says, I don't know why this happens. It could be a few things. So the unconscious maybe has actually some idea of constraint. It's not logical constraint, but its idea of constraint is what is acceptable to the preconscious, and maybe it's abiding by that. Maybe the preconscious censorship actually does play more of a role in intermediation between the perceptual system and the unconscious than Freud thought in this book. He doesn't know. I don't know. That's just what happens. So those are the two, I guess, primary energy economies in he calls them the psi systems, the progression in waking life, regression in sleeping life. One more interesting thing is that during waking life, these processes of condensation, of displacement, of building up memories and experiences from that day of waking life, and then those being coordinated via an infantile wish in the unconscious seeking fulfillment. That's happening during waking life as well. This is not something that only happens when you're asleep. All of this stuff, this material is being built up when you're awake. Then when you go to sleep, it, through the unconscious, hits the perceptual system. More of it is able to get past this relaxed censorship from the preconsciousness and hit your conscious mind as well. And I thought that was cool too, that idea that even when you're awake, your mind is building up all of these different ways for your infantile wishes to escape censorship and get into your consciousness through dreams. Yeah, that's what I've got to say about that.
Do I have anything to add to that? No, I think you covered all the major parts. And that brings us basically to the end of our notes on the major concepts of the book. Yeah. Would it be worth either rereading the quote that you read earlier, that like the summary thing, or doing a quick nutshell review of, okay, so maybe this quote that Jack read at the beginning of the episode, maybe it will make more sense now.
Let me read it again with a much drier mouth than before. Yeah, here it is. Okay, so this is from the end of the chapter, secondary revision from the section The Dream Work. It's page 328 to 329 of the Oxford World's Classics edition, if people are interested. I'm sure people are really concerned that I'm just making up quotes for some nebulous reason. So, the work of the psyche in the formation of dreams can be broken down into two tasks. It generates the dream thoughts and it transforms them into the dream content. The dream thoughts are entirely reasonable and are formed with all the expensive psychical energy we are capable of. They belong to that dimension of our thinking which has not become conscious, and from which, by some transposition, our conscious thoughts also arise. However many unanswered questions and puzzles the dream thoughts raise, all the same, these puzzles do not have any particular relation to dreams, and do not merit treatment among the problems of dreams. On the other hand, the other task of transforming the unconscious thoughts into the dream content is peculiar to the life of dreams and characteristic of it. This is the true dream work, and it is far more remote from the model of waking thought than even the most determined belittlers of the psyche's feats of dream formation have thought. It is not that it is more negligent, more unreasonable, more forgetful, more incomplete, say, than waking thought. It is qualitatively something completely different from it, and so at first not comparable to it. It does not think, calculate, judge in any way at all. It confines itself to reshaping. It can be described exhaustively if we keep our eye on the conditions which its product has to satisfy. Above all, this product, the dream, has to be removed from the influence of the censorship, and for this purpose the dream work makes use of the displacement of psychical intensities to the point of a transvaluation of all psychical values. Thoughts are to be reproduced exclusively or predominantly in terms of the material provided by visual and oral memory traces, and this requires the dream work to take account of representability, which it does by setting up new displacements. Greater intensities than the dream thoughts have at their disposal at night are probably to be created, and this purpose is served by the ample condensation undertaken with the elements of the dream thoughts. Little account is taken of the logical relations in the thought material. They are ultimately given a hidden representation in particular formal features of the dreams. The affects of the dream thoughts are subject to less modifications than the imagined ideas of their content are. As a rule, they are suppressed. Where they are retained, they are separated from their ideas and combined with affects of a similar tonality. Only one part of the dream work, the revisions, variable in extent, made by our partially roused waking thought, conforms to the conception our authorities would apply to the entire activity of dream formation. So there's that quote again. There are subsequent ones which are pretty good, which are about the structure of the conscious and the unconscious. I don't know if it's worth reading those out too. He does have really, really nice summary pages every now and then, particularly in the latter half of the book.
I guess in terms of explaining the book, I feel like we've done a pretty... obviously, there's a lot more detailing. He pulls on a lot of his own dreams and case studies from his clients.
In 2 hours, we've done, I think, fairly well. There's a lot to this book.
Yeah, and I guess I'm starting to hit a wall pretty hard. I didn't sleep terribly well last night, so I guess my if we can, maybe wrap up in a tick. But I guess as a kind of parting notes, I suppose like we haven't gone too deep into criticisms, which is fine. I suppose my only major criticism to point out is Popper did a very good job of using Freud and Adler and Marx as examples of thinkers who didn't meet his criterion of what he calls demarcation, the demarcation between science and pseudoscience, and that demarcation is falsifiability. And in particular, like what we think of as natural philosophy or science of the natural world, that's empirical falsifiability. But even within non-physical things like mathematics, the role of proof and disproof is serving the same function with regards to understanding the world of abstract entities and their nature and relations with one another. We do have a line of demarcation, which is falsification, is still a form of falsification. And with regards to philosophy, the fact that you can or can't argue and actually come up with the logic. So even with metaphysics, Popper's same line of demarcation, there are metaphysical philosophies that you can't use an empirical test to distinguish between, but you can have an argument and argue, I suppose, rationally whether or not this metaphysics makes sense or this other metaphysics doesn't make sense. And with that being said, the only thing that we sort of touched on recently, which is repression, you can't falsify repression. You can always...
Yeah. And in fact, repression can just be turned around to argue against whichever problem is raised with respect to repression.
And importantly, Popper made this point of saying, if a theory can explain everything, then it doesn't explain anything. Or in Deutsch's terminology, it's easily varied. There's no functional relationship between the theory and the thing it's purported to explain, because you can just explain anything. Or inversely, you can just arbitrarily modify the theory to explain a new thing. So an example of that from psychoanalysis would be Adler. Adler basically did exactly the same thing as Freud, except instead of using sexual wish fulfillment, it was to do with power and domination. So Adler was just made this variant of it, and it didn't really change his ability to just explain all of the neuroses in his patients, just like Freud. And so it's an important criticism. I think it's a really deep criticism that basically renders, at least with regards to repression, that entire pathway is essentially unfruitful. It's not going to lead to progress because you can't make progress without falsification. But that doesn't take away from the rest of Freud's contributions and the importance of those contributions and the insights that he had into a new theory of mind and all the stuff that we said earlier. So that's probably the only thing I'll mention in terms of criticisms.
I basically agree with you. So I could enumerate my criticisms of this book, but they all basically boil down to what you just said. So it's particularly the ease of variability of parts of it. And then with repression, so it's a really important part of his theory functionally. A lot of it doesn't work without the repressive apparatus. But it's, at least clinically, it leaves so much to the analyst to be extremely disciplined and not just say that everything is repression. Because the broadness of repression in Freud's theory doesn't foreclose on the ability to do something useful. It's totally up to the analyst to watch themselves and not just say anything they don't like is repression.
Yeah.
And maybe a more robust theory would limit the ability of someone to do that.
Yeah.
And then that brings me around to something I want to ask you. So despite these significant criticism or a significant cluster of criticisms, why do you think it's still worthwhile reading Freud today? Because
there's two elements.
I think this is worth engaging with.
There's two elements. One is it's historically important for anybody who's into neuroscience or psychology or theory of mind or even AI, I'd say. Other than the history of it, from a philosophical point of view, if you compare what Freud's saying to Jung and also Popper and post-Freudians and stuff, you're seeing really smart people come up with really deep criticisms and improvements on one another. And this is part of the process of us creating new knowledge. And if nothing else, Freud has contributed to a new, at least in the West, conception of the mind as, essentially these ideas of there being distinct subsystems of the mind, that they have structural and functional relationships to one another, that there's elements that are conscious and unconscious, explicit and inexplicit, that you can have behavioral, physical, and conscious manifestations of unconscious or subconscious processes and ideas. Those are all really important ideas still in modern psychology. Deeply, deeply important if you go and do any sort of therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy or CBT or dialectical behavioral therapy or any of they're all informed by those fundamental insights or axioms, for lack of a better word, that basically, as far as the West is concerned, originated with Freud.
Yeah, he created a new soil for new thoughts to grow in.
We live in Freud's paradigm, fundamentally, I'd say.
Yeah,
even if the
like
details...
I said at the beginning of the episode, even people who don't agree with Freud, in putting forward a theory of mind or of psychology, many of them will still feel the need to respond to him.
Yeah. And they won't disagree with some of those really deep ideas, like there is an unconscious, and it does play a role in behavior and psychosis and stuff.
Another aspect of Freud that I think makes him worthwhile is his influence on the arts is gigantic. Because you can imagine for anyone engaged in artistic pursuits, this idea that that your conscious mind is a small aperture onto this enormous uncharted land of the unconscious is very exciting and potentially very creatively fruitful as well. And then maybe even more than influence on the arts is artistic criticism is maybe where Freud is most alive and well today. Another aspect of this book I like a lot is that it is in some way an extended discussion on desire and where desire comes from.
Yeah.
Which is really fascinating. And also just because, say, 2025 globalized capitalism is so deeply libidinal. It's also pretty important from that perspective. There's this decentralized desire for creation and fulfillment machine.
Yeah. So it's definitely worth reading. And also, if you want to understand, say, Jung better, it's great for that as well.
Yeah.
So I don't have anything else left to say. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, I've hit a wall. I hit a wall about half an hour ago in terms of like my energy level. So we should. Well, I probably need to jump off. But do you have any other major things to say?
No other major things. I recommend.
I've got one more major thing to say, but I'll save it for Antique.
Okay. No, I recommend this book. I really liked it. On the basis of this, I want to read more Freud.
Yeah. I want to read a couple more Freud books. Yeah, for sure.
Shout out to everyone on the Patreon. Massive thanks to people making this show possible.
Yeah.
Got some cool things coming up. I've been reading some books I've been really enjoying. Got some new people I want to get
bonus
on the show.
episodes.
Yeah. And bonus episodes too, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's probably all from me.
Yeah. My last final shout out is announcement. I'm now engaged. I've got disappointing news for J-Man. I am not in fact gay. I do in fact have a female partner, and I am now engaged as of this weekend just past, which, given the offset, is probably a few weeks ago now from the listener's point of view. So I'm just going to give a quick shout out to my now fiance, and we shall call her F.
Big shout out to F.
F, you are the S to my unnamed almological narrator. And I love you very much. And if you've listened to this episode, I hope you do. I will give you a one-time discount for our Patreon membership, 20%.
To the $60,000, yeah. Only $50,000.
Yeah, so, speaking of libidinal energy, I'm going to go and see F.
See you next time.
Thanks for listening.